Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into, well, the state of World of Warcraft, a game that's been such a fixture for, gosh, 2 decades.
Right. And there's clearly this huge conversation happening. Very passionate sometimes.
We've seen a lot of community discussions, analyses, and there's one really detailed sort of proposal out there about where things stand and maybe where they could go next.
That's it. Players are really digging into their experiences, pinpointing what frustrates them about the current game, what people call retail WoW.
And comparing it.
Yeah, contrasting it sharply with what they remember loving about the early days, particularly classic WoW.
So our mission today is to really get into that. We want to understand, the core criticisms, what specific things keep coming up.
Exactly. And then explore this comprehensive plan that's been laid out. It's a plan suggesting maybe the future involves looking back to the game's roots, in a way.
We'll break down why some players feel the way they do, step by step.
And then walk through this whole reboot idea, phase by phase, looking at the concrete actions being suggested.
All right, let's jump right in then, those pain points. When people talk about retail WoW feeling, well, maybe broken is too strong, but definitely problematic. What are the big issues they bring up?
A really dominant one is something often called borrowed power fatigue. Just think about the last, 4 major expansions. Artifacts, Azeroth, essences, covenants.
Right.
Each one brought in these totally new complex systems you had to grind. Invest all this time to make your character stronger.
Okay.
But then boom, next expansion hits. And that whole power system, it's either gone or just irrelevant.
So it's like you're constantly renting power, not actually building something permanent for your character.
Exactly. You put all this effort in and then it just evaporates.
That sounds incredibly draining. I can see why people call it fatigue.
It really is. And that feeling, it kind of leads right into another big criticism. Community erosion.
Okay, how so?
Well, back in the day, you were on a specific server, right? Your realm, your reputation, it actually mattered.
Yeah, I remember that.
But tools like cross-realm LFG, looking for group, or LFR for raids, and server sharding, where zones mix players from different servers.
Convenient for finding groups fast, I guess.
Sure, convenient.
Yeah.
But the criticism is they've really diluted that server identity, that sense of belonging.
So it feels less like a neighborhood where you know people and more like just grabbing random strangers for a task.
That's a good way to put it. Less community, more anonymous matchmaking. Accountability kind of goes out the window.
Right.
And those organic connections you used to build just by, bumping into people on your server, much harder now.
Okay, so power systems feel temporary, community feels weaker. What else? Story is usually huge in RPGs.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of specific criticism there, too.
I've definitely heard rumblings.
Yeah, particularly around the Shadowlands expansion. The character, the jailer, is often mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
The feeling, basically, is that the story went too big, too cosmic, too fast.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, it sort of retroactively undermined years of established lore.
Oof, like pulling one thread and the whole history unravels a bit.
Kind of. Complex characters felt reduced, simplified. And the main bad guy, the jailer, a lot of players felt he was underdeveloped, hard to connect with or even really care about his grand plan.
Okay, so system fatigue, social fabric fraying, story feeling disconnected or even damaging to the past. What else adds to this feeling of the current game being maybe just too much?
System creep and currency sprawl are massive ones.
System creep? Like just too many overlapping systems?
Exactly. You jump into the game, especially after a break, and there are just layers upon layers of different in-game things, each with its own rules, its own grinds.
And currencies.
Oh, the currencies. The material we looked at points out there are currently over 500 different currencies in the game.
Wait, 500? Seriously?
Yeah.
500? How is that even possible? How do you manage that? It sounds like a nightmare, especially if you're a returning player.
It's incredibly confusing, yeah. Just bewildering. And then for the players pushing the really high-end stuff, Mythic Plus dungeons, top-tier rating.
Yeah.
There's talk of burnout there, too. The constant tuning adjustments, the heavy reliance on external add-ons just to track everything and, to perform optimally.
It becomes less like playing a game and more like managing a spreadsheet.
It can feel like that.
Yeah.
Like endless competition, a treadmill, rather than maybe sustained, deep engagement with the actual game design.
Okay, that paints a really clear picture of the frustrations people are voicing right now. Lots of complexity, temporary gains, maybe losing that core connection.
Right.
But you said this often gets contrasted with the past. What was it about classic WoW that people look back on so fondly? According to these discussions, what were the key pillars that worked?
Well, number one is probably that strong social fabric we just touched on.
Because of the server structure.
Exactly. Being on a single realm, very limited cross-realm stuff for important content like raids. Things like meaningful guild reputation tied to server firsts, even just slower travel.
Slower travel, how did that help?
It sounds counterintuitive, right? But it encouraged players to rely on each other more. Ask for help, group up for quests, maybe get a portal from a mage. It fostered interaction. You had a reputation on your server, good or bad.
So the friction, the inconvenience, ironically created stronger social bonds.
Tends to be the feeling, yeah. Another huge pillar was what's called evergreen power.
Evergreen power, meaning it lasted.
Yeah. In Classic and the early expansions, talent trees felt really impactful. Choices mattered. And gear. Itemization scaled more horizontally.
Horizontally, what does that mean exactly?
It means gear you got from, say, the very first raid, Molten Core. It could actually stay useful for months, maybe even through the next tier of content for some slots. It wasn't instantly obsolete the moment a new patch dropped with a slightly higher item level green quest rewards.
Ah, I see. So your character's strength felt like it was building cumulatively, permanently over time. Your achievements felt more lasting.
Precisely. Your effort felt significant, like it had real staying power.
Makes total sense. And the story. You mentioned the issues with the later cosmic scale.
Right. Contrast that with vanilla. Wow. The storytelling there really resonated with a lot of people because it was so grounded.
Grounded how?
The focus was on regional conflicts, stuff happening in Azeroth, fighting the Scourge in the Plague Lands, helping out the caravans and the barons, dealing with local threats. The stakes felt immediate, tangible.
Triple heroes, local problems.
Exactly. These zone-level stories, maybe they weren't galaxy-ending epics, but they built the world's charm and depth in a way that many feel the later, bigger, more cosmic stories kind of missed. They felt more resonant.
Smaller stories, but maybe with more heart, more impact on the world you were actually running around in.
Okay.
And the economy. You mentioned currencies earlier.
The economy simplicity was key back then.
Yeah.
Gold felt valuable, like really valuable. And professions. They weren't just a side thing. They were often the primary way to get really powerful gear, especially before raiding heavily. Crafters were essential.
So players relied on each other for gear too, not just dungeons.
Absolutely. Inflation was also way lower, especially before the WoW token came in, which lets players basically buy gold with real money. It felt like a more stable, player-driven market.
Okay, so established the current frustrations, looked back at what seemed to work well in a classic. Now let's get to the core of this big proposal, the Azeroth Reforged idea.
Right.
It's being presented as this, potential way forward, maybe even a separate track alongside the current game, blending those classic ideas with modern improvements. How does this plan actually suggest doing that?
It lays out a pretty detailed multi-phase roadmap. Phase 1, the first 6 months or so, is called Purge and Squish.
Purge and Squish. Sounds dramatic.
It kind of is. The main goals are retire all those layers of borrowed power we talked about.
Yeah.
Just gone.
Wow, okay. Clean slate.
Totally. Unify character stats,
Yeah.
simplify things,
Right.
Implement a huge, 90% gold squish to tackle inflation.
90%, that's massive.
It is. And drastically cut those currencies. Remember the 500 plus, to cut them down to maybe around 30 core ones?
Much more manageable.
Yeah. The idea is a reset, simple itemization, but importantly, keeping modern quality of life stuff like transmog, changing your gear's appearance and the collection's UI, keep the good modern conveniences.
So, a radical cleanup, but keeping the interface improvements. What's phase 2?
Phase 2 is all about realm identity. Planned for months, 6 to 12. This would involve launching fresh, reforged servers.
Fresh start.
Exactly. And critically, no character transfers allowed, at least initially, and no WoW token use at all.
Okay, protecting the new environment.
Right. They also suggest disabling cross-realm LFG, LFR for most core content. Maybe even bring back things like attunements for raids or key dungeons.
Attunements.
Yeah.
Those quest chains you have to do just to get in.
Yeah. To encourage server interaction, make people cooperate within their own realm community again.
Rebuilding that server identity.
That's the goal. But they'd keep a modern server-specific group finder tool, like a bulletin board system, not automatic matchmaking. Something seen in other MMOs.
So make people interact on their server, but still give them a modern tool to find groups within that server. Okay, makes sense. What about longer term? Content.
That's phase 3, the classic plus content loop, running from month 12 up to maybe 30 months. This is where new content rolls out, but the key is a more consistent, predictable schedule, like maybe a new raid tier every 16 weeks.
Predictability helps. And where would this new content be?
The proposal suggests using untacked or underused locations within Azeroth itself. Places mentioned are like the Karazhan Crypts or Grim Betal, stuff that exists but hasn't been fully developed.
Okay, exploring existing mysteries. And the gear?
The focus would be on that horizontal gear progression. Again, making gear last longer. And reintroducing attunements as part of the progression. Mythic plus dungeons would stick around, but maybe capped at a lower level, like plus 10, and with fewer seasonal affixes to track. Make it less of a constantly shifting burden.
So, new content, but structured more like the old days, emphasizing longer-term value and less complexity creep. Professions were a big strength of Classic. How does this plan address those?
That's phase 4, Professions 2.0, planned for months 18 to 30. The big idea here is implementing talent trees for crafting professions, kind of like the Dragonflight expansion did.
Giving crafting more depth.
Exactly. And a key suggestion is allowing crafters to make unique, powerful, soulbound enhancements for gear. Things only they can make.
Ah, so crafting becomes essential again, giving crafters a real identity and market power.
Right. Rebuilding that player-driven economy, powered by valuable crafts. But again, keeping modern conveniences like a streamlined craft ordering UI.
Makes sense. Okay, power, community, content, professions. What about the story moving forward in this reforged world?
That's Phase 5, Story Reset, which is sort of ongoing throughout. The core idea is to shift the narrative focus back to Azeroth, back to regional threats, faction campaigns.
Learning from the critiques of the cosmic stuff.
Definitely.
Right.
Think like dealing with Red Ridge bandits becoming a serious regional problem again, or a resurgence of the Solithid insectoids. Focus on local, tangible stakes that players can see and affect in the zones.
Like that grounded storytelling from vanilla.
Yeah, but using modern tools like the in-engine cutscenes for presentation. The discussions even mention learning from things like the Red Dawn critique of some past storylines. Focus on defending your home, your faction's territory first. Keep it relatable.
Bringing the focus back down to earth, quite literally, but with modern polish. Okay, this is a massive, detailed vision. What about the underlying structures? How would this reforged track be governed? How would feedback work? And, how would it make money?
Good questions. For governance, the idea floated is having community councils per realm, learning from tests in other games. Give servers more direct input.
Realm-specific councils. Interesting.
And feedback.
For feedback, they suggest regular seasonal public test realm Windows PTRs. Let players test upcoming changes, but maybe with limited character copies allowed, so testing is more focused.
Okay.
And crucially, public changelogs that don't just list what changed, but explain the reasoning behind it, the why, building transparency and trust.
Explaining the why, yeah, that seems huge for getting player buy-in. And monetization, how would this work financially?
For these specific reforged realms, the proposal is pretty clear. A cosmetic shop only, nothing that affects player power, no pay-to-win elements.
Just cosmetics.
Just cosmetics. And really importantly, no WoW token allowed for at least the first 2 years. Let the internal economy stabilize without that external gold injection.
Right, protect that player-driven economy they want to rebuild. And the subscription. The idea is the standard WoW subscription would grant access to both the ongoing retail game and these new reforged realms. 1 sub, 2 ways to play.
1 sub, access to both. Okay, now this sounds like a huge undertaking. Any massive change like this has risks. What potential challenges does this whole concept identify?
Fragmentation is a big one. The risk of splitting the player base too thin between retail and reforged.
Yeah, that's always a concern with fresh start servers. How do they suggest mitigating that?
By staggering the realm launches, maybe by region. Don't open everything everywhere all at once. Manage the population flow better.
Try to avoid ghost towns right off the bat. Okay. What about, accessibility? Going back to classic principles might make some casual players worry about difficulty or, hardcore gatekeeping.
Definitely a concern raised.
Yeah.
The suggested mitigation is first, keep all the modern accessibility tools, UI scaling, colorblind modes, all that good stuff.
Right.
And second, offer flexible raid sizes. Specifically 10-player and 25-player options for raids. That allows different group sizes, different levels of commitment, making endgame more approachable.
Keep the accessibility tools, offer flexibility in grouping. Makes sense. And given the lore criticisms we discussed, what's the risk of just repeating story mistakes? Lore fatigue setting in again.
Yeah, huge risk.
Yeah.
The suggestions there are things like hiring dedicated lore editors, people whose job is purely maintaining consistency and quality.
Okay.
And maybe setting a firm rule. Like, no major cosmic retcons, no huge narrative shifts, unless they've been significantly foreshadowed across multiple previous expansions.
So big changes have to feel earned, set up properly, not just dropped in out of nowhere.
Exactly. Prevent those jarring, out-of-left-field story beats that annoyed people before.
Okay, so pulling all this together, the current frustrations, the look back at classic strengths, and this really detailed phase-by-phase blueprint. What's the core idea here? The bottom line of this Azeroth reforged concept.
The bottom line, as it's presented, is basically that a leaner, more focused, classic-inspired Azeroth Reforged track could potentially live alongside the current retail game. It offers a dedicated home for players who really crave that specific blend of social connection, evergreen progression, and grounded storytelling.
So not necessarily replacing retail, but offering an alternative.
Exactly. It's framed as a way to let the existing game keep evolving and experimenting, while also providing this fresh start built on core principles that a significant part of the player base feels have been lost over time. The formula they kind of point to sums it up well. Less borrowed power, more permanent player power, fewer server shards, stronger server communities, local stories, leading to global stakes eventually.
Wow. That is, a really comprehensive picture that emerges. You can clearly see the pain points players are talking about. You see the specific things they loved from the past, and then this incredibly detailed plan for a potential way forward. It certainly gives you, the listener, a lot to chew on. Whether you're playing WoW now, played it in the past, or are just interested in how these massive online worlds evolve.
It absolutely does, and it kind of leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? Thinking about any long-running game, or really any system that evolves over time, if the goal is to recapture some essence, or fix long-standing problems by looking backward, how do you figure out which parts of the past are truly fundamental, the real building blocks, versus which parts are maybe just nostalgia, that rosy glow.
Right.
And how do you balance that desire for stability, for meaningful progression, for strong community, with a constant pressure in online games for new content, for change, for keeping things fresh? It's a tough balancing act.